We will call the January 20th Special Zoning Board of Appeals meeting to order at 6:16. Please rise for the pledge. Pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Move into roll call.
Okay, Liz Presnell here, Ryan Buckley,
Absent.
Judy Lannon here, Andrew Tyson.
Here.
Taylor Shanstall.
He's excused.
Look for approval of the minutes for the January 7th, 2019 regular ZBA meeting. I had emailed Jennifer with a couple changes to the times that were listed, and those were sent back out via email, so they've been since corrected. I don't know if anyone else had any objections. If not, I would take a motion to approve.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Motion Judy,
Second.
second Liz. All those in favor?
Aye.
No opposed. Moving on to correspondence and board reports. Included in your packet are the board and commission expiration dates. Always trying to keep in mind if there's anybody you think might be interested in donating their time. Clearly, we could use a few extras. There's also included in your packet the announcement for upcoming available training opportunities. We typically look at that and see whose terms are requiring additional training, and you can get with Peter on that. Some of those are closer to home than others, so.
Yeah, so if you're interested in attending a training, and I would encourage all of you, as it states in our rules and procedure, throughout your 3-year term, the rules and procedures state that you attend at least one training, either held by MAP, Michigan Association of Planning, MTA, Michigan Township Association, MML, Michigan Municipal League, or some other form of equivalent training. You do have, that was in your packet for you, the 9 golden rules of defensible decision-making. That was provided by our, as was announced at the last regular meeting, Rodney Nanny, who's in the audience today with us in attendance at the tonight's meeting. Rodney is the township's new Community and Economic Development Director. He oversees the building department, rental department, and building department, and of course planning and zoning. So he's here tonight with us at the meeting. And in addition to, if you're interested in receiving MAP, some of you may have gotten a brochure, other brochures for these trainings. They'll come to the township. But if you're interested in receiving any kind of brochure or future monthly publication from MAP, just let me know. And instead of them coming here to the township, we can have it set up to where they'll mail it to you at your house. So that's what I have to say.
At this point, we would like to try and get an approval of tonight's agenda. The goal here is we'll plow through some of this housekeeping stuff, and then hopefully we'll have at least another alternate joining us. So if either of you would like to make a motion to approve tonight's agenda, I would accept that.
Motion to approve.
Motion Liz, second Judy. All those in favor? Aye. Motion carries. Which would bring us to our public comment. We'll move into public comment, which is restricted to 3 minutes regarding issues not on this agenda. Public comment is open at 6:20. Seeing no takers, we will close public comment at 6:20. Which brings us to our new business. So if the applicant is willing to continue to patiently wait for a few more minutes, we'll go ahead and take a pause as we wait for our alternates. The applicant wants to continue to wait for our fifth member. Do you want to proceed?
Well, what's the procedure?
Well, at this point, we could open up the public hearing, and
It's going to last about 30 seconds because I don't see anyone in the audience. So we can formally open the public hearing and then begin conversation, but then Ryan's going to be playing catch-up, so it's up to you.
We can get started with public hearing and stuff like that.
Okay.
That's fine.
All right.
I will say this, it may be best to open and close the hearing.
Sure.
But not have any further discussion.
Correct.
while Ryan is here.
Correct. So at 6:26, we will be opening the public hearing for all three items on tonight's agenda. New business, PZA 20-01, interpretation of text, 20-02, administrative review, and PBAR 20-01, all for McGurk Mini Storage located at 3046 Jens Way. Public hearing is open. Anyone wishes to comment, please step forward. Seeing no one interested in commenting, we will close the public hearing at 6:27.
Excuse me, Peter, could I have an agenda? I've had everything at my office, but I wasn't prepared to show up today.
Thanks for coming. Short call here.
Because I live close. Thank you very much.
There you go.
yeah, very well. Yeah, it's been a while.
Do we have any extra of this stuff we could pass it on to Jim?
I'm gonna have it up here.
Oh, perfect.
While we wait, I'm going to move on to other business. We have one item on the agenda for other business, and that is to consider cancellation of the February 5th, 2020 ZBA meeting. As Peter mentioned to me earlier, there was no one turned in with application in time to be on that agenda. And in light of that, and the idea that tonight, if a decision is reached on anything, we would move forward with that decision by signing a resolution that would make that effective 21 days after tonight's decision and not require us to come back and meet. So
So
if
moved.
everyone is in favor of that, I've got a motion from Jim. I would take a second.
I'll second that.
Second by Judy. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Thank you. We're trying, guys. We're doing everything we can to plow through everything on the agenda. Appreciate your patience.
So we're waiting for someone else to get here, is that what we're doing?
We are, yeah. We're waiting on Ryan. He's on his way. You beat him here.
That's good, I won that race. I don't win many races anymore.
I'll quit taking up the space of two people with all the paperwork.
Ryan, just a quick recap here. We've kind of plowed through the bulk of the agenda, and we have opened and closed our public hearing and are now looking at the 3 new business items on the agenda.
Thank you.
So at this point, I am going to call the applicant up. Actually, I'll let Peter give his spiel first, and then we'll call the applicant up.
So tonight we've held the public hearing. We have 3 items. We have a text interpretation, administrative review, and a variance. All 3 of these requests revolve around the same issue, including wall signage and freestanding signage for Westwood condominium. I have provided in your packet a memo. The reason for the request: both freestanding wall signage for Westwood condominium. History: owner has previously been granted a variance for additional freestanding signs and wall signs. Owner has previously permitted to replace 2 non-conforming billboards with 1 new LED billboard. Owner previously denied variance for additional freestanding sign. That was for Peterbilt. Tonight, we have an objective. The board is to determine from section 5.8C1 A through E if a variance should be granted or denied with reason. With the administrative review and the text interpretation, the ZBA is the final interpretation of our zoning ordinance, so the applicant is looking for your interpretation. As far as administrative review, that is where I have made a determination and decision, and they're asking you to review that decision. In your memo, I've added something new. I've done some key findings that we'll be doing for this and future applications. In those key findings, Westwood condominium is a division of the existing structure and not a division of land. Westwood condominium created separate units, each with their own legal description within the single existing structure. However, these units are still located on one lot as defined by the zoning ordinance, section 3.41.c and 3.65. ZBA minutes from January 2nd, 2019 do not mention the township advising the applicant that a condominium of the existing building would allow additional signs. Applicant's proposed signage chart for variance request of wall signage and freestanding signage appears to not match additional drawing labeled unit 1 through 13. It appears what is listed as freestanding signage is the wall signage and vice versa, and so I don't know if anyone else noticed that. There might have been a bit of confusion. Wall signs must not extend past the top of the building. The depiction of new wall signage on the applicant's plans is inconsistent with sign ordinance requirements. Additional freestanding signs are incompatible with the township's master plan policy for commercial and employment center to limit clutter of business signs. The additional freestanding signs are also incompatible with the purpose and intent of the township sign regulations to keep signs within a reasonable scale and to reduce visual distractors to motorists. My recommendation listed in regard to the interpretation and administrative review, I would determine that there are not separate lots, that each lot is only permitted 1 freestanding sign. For the variance, I would deny any additional freestanding signs. Denial of additional freestanding signs does not deprive the applicant of rights commonly enjoyed by other properties in the same zoning district. And finally, each unit has already permitted a wall sign that meets the requirements of the zoning ordinance, no variance needed. So if you have any additional questions, I'm here, but I've given you my recommendation and my key findings from reviewing the applications myself. Just a note, we want to articulate our motions accurately so that Jennifer can record them accurately. And please feel free, I would encourage you to use language from my recommendation to help you. You can add on what you want, but if you keep it to what my recommendation is, that'll also help us with getting an accurate motion. So,
Thank you, Peter. At this
Peter,
time,
oh, excuse me, Peter, could I have a copy of your language? I was, didn't know it was coming tonight. I left this at my office, so.
okay.
At this time, I'd like to invite the applicant up to the podium to explain their situation.
Good evening. My name is Mark McKellar. I represent the applicant this evening on these three requests, and I recognize some of these faces and others I don't. I want to start off with the reason we gave you the myriad of requests was essentially wanted to provide all the options we had available to us and try to work out one of these that would provide us what we needed through the board's review. So it wasn't intended to be anything other than trying to give you every option possible to see if we can find a resolution. I want to start off with a couple things. One is, I hope that Peter also provided a recommended language for approval. It's a little inconsistent and generally inappropriate to make a recommendation, only provide the recommendation language. So hopefully you guys, if there is an approval, you would have language available to you that would include an approval of one of these. I want to address the findings of fact. I think those are actually important to note. So I'm going to go right through his letter, which I think you folks just went through, and we'll address those one by one. First one, and probably the most important here, is this interpretation of the Westwood condominium as division of an existing structure and not division of land. No such thing exists in the world of law in Michigan. The Condominium Act only provides for the separation of legal descriptions into units. There's no such thing as a site condo in the law that separates the distinction of a legal description in a building and a division that's separate in land. A condominium is a condominium is a condominium. The Condominium Act provides for what that is. And in fact, your definitions include that a lot, in the definition of lots, includes that specific language. The condominium is a legal description unto itself of a division of property, land. You can call it a structure, but it's a separate legal description. The distinction he makes in general nomenclature is fine, but the law does not recognize that. There's no such distinction in your ordinance or the Condominium Act. And that's the distinct situation here, because each unit is a tax parcel ID, identified separate legal description with separate ownership. You can have common elements which are owned by the common group of the condo association, the limited common elements which are limited to certain groups or rights to certain units. But the units themselves, whether they're inside a building or a piece of land, are distinct, separate legal descriptions and have legal rights unto themselves. So as to that first point, that's a mischaracterization of the law in your ordinance. And what I would point out to you is in your ordinance and definitions is the definition of lot. And definition of lot is important because you guys don't define a parcel unto itself, but you define a lot, and a lot makes a parcel synonymous with it. So what it says is a lot. A lot is a parcel of land of at least sufficient size to meet the minimum requirements for use. Coverage and lot area adequate to provide such setback areas and open space as required by the ordinance. Such lots shall have frontage on a designated street, road, right-of-way, or easement, and may consist of, in the case of a division of land on the basis of condominium ownership, lot shall also include the portion of the condominium project designed and intended for separate ownership and use described in the master deed. Our master deed describes separate units, separate ownership, separate descriptions. So that's the first basis we need to understand with regard to his interpretation. Second issue is also addressed in that interpretation. The third point, the ZBA minutes from January 2nd do not mention the township advising the applicant that condominium of existing building would allow additional signage. That is correct. However, there's 9 minutes of dialogue in the official deliberation of that ZBA meeting with that exact language. In fact, the chair in that meeting suggested that they make the condo division a condition of the approval of these signs for individual units, because that's what would be required. Mr. Milkey at the time provided that if they did that, that would mean they wouldn't have to come back for a variance, so why don't they just do the site condo or the condominium first? There's 7 minutes of dialogue, which we can pull up. It's on YouTube and on the website at minutes 32 and 39 that discuss specifically that intent and understanding from this ZBA. So our clients, rather than go out and do what they want to do in any fashion on their own. They took the direction of this existing board and moved forward with the condominium, the master deed, the great expense to go through that, which importantly, as you would note, is unique in the sense that you relinquish your rights to the property and control of it over time because it's a condo unit. If they retained the whole thing and then just leased it out, those rights are not individualized. Those are rights of the land are retained into one person. So condominiums and land divisions recognize those separate rights and the lack of control, giving autonomy to those separate ownerships. Therefore, it would make sense that they would also have their right to have their own sign. That's pretty typical in the area of law related to condominiums. The next page, the applicant's proposed signage chart for variance request of all signage is the top of the second page. And freestanding signage appears to not match additional drawings labeled unit 1 through 13. It appears what is listed as freestanding signage is the wall signage and vice versa. I candidly went through that just to make sure we didn't make a mistake. I don't think that's true. I think our chart, which identifies wall signage calculations and the freestanding signage calculations, are accurate in our drawings. I cannot find that error. I don't know if Peter has a more specific intent or issue, and I'd be happy to address that. If that's an error, I'm certain that it was not intentional, but I don't see it. I'm going to move on to the next issue. If you do find that, let me know. Wall signs must not extend past the top of the building. This one, I'll acknowledge that the Peterbilt sign, as proposed, would exceed it. However, the other ones on the corners don't exceed. That's an architectural design. Those corners already exceed the heights of the flat portion of the roof, but are there as placards. That was part of the site plan and building approval. So as to the Peterbilt sign as proposed above the standard line, we would capitulate and say that we can lower that and we'll work with it unless we request a variance on it. As to the other signs, those are part of the existing building design. And that's how the current signs are utilized currently on the building. So with regard to that, I think the only exception would be the Peterbilt sign. Otherwise, I think we're in compliance. The additional freestanding signs are incomplete with the township's master plan policy for commercial and employment center of limit clutter and business signs. Well, that policy is just a provision statement and does not actually provide any guidance other than conceptually what should be in the future. The fact is when you limit cluster of business signs, we're trying to actually limit the cluster of the signs. We're trying to say we're entitled to a bunch of individual signs, okay? What's really we're trying to do here is say we're entitled to individual signs for each unit. We know that doesn't make a lot of sense. So we want the interpretation that says we have that right. But we understand we should make these individual marquees, with multiple listings of businesses. That makes more sense. So we're trying to meet that criterion to not have 13 individual freestanding signs in this development. But we also have to understand the legal analysis is that you have to get there first before then you can then cluster them into one sign. But more importantly, that's not binding. The zoning ordinance is what binding. So if that was intended to be part of signage ordinance, it should have been included that as a standard. That's just how these things work. The last issue is the additional freestanding signs are also incompatible with the purpose and intent of the township sign regulation to keep signs within a reasonable scale and to reduce visual distractions to motorists. I agree that if the intent is for visual distraction to motorists, that making one individual sign is probably less distracting than 13 freestanding signs along the road. That's certainly a safety concern. We made that an issue in our application that we think that it certainly would be better to have, a few individual multi-business signs rather than 13 individual unit signs. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have 13 of them out there in such a short distance when it's a safety, concern. I get the idea that that's probably intended in the welfare and safety of the community, but the spirit of the ordinance is tough to describe. It's a really subjective thing. There's no spirit policy, so I don't know exactly when it is or isn't spirit of the ordinance, and you can only go by the guiding principles and language that are in the ordinance itself. And I think that we still meet the spirit of the ordinance. We're trying to acknowledge the fact that this is one of those unique things where the law really hasn't addressed it in your ordinance. A large condominium unit with frontage that really isn't sufficient for a bunch of individual signs, although they're allowed. We're trying to make, one entrance sign with numerous signs on it to address that kind of implied safety intent. So when I go through these points, I find them a little less than helpful. And no, I'm not to offend here anybody, but that's just not what the law provides for. The last thing is, he provided a recommendation regarding administrative review. I would just like to note that the administrator being appealed in a review doesn't have the authority to provide a recommendation for his own appeal. So as to the administrative review, I don't think it'd be appropriate that this board utilize his interpretation of his own appeal. That would not be appropriate. His interpretation as to the other things are absolutely appropriate, and I think you should take those into consideration. However, I think ours are more compelling. So as to the facts, you've seen the application plans under the text amendment interpretation. I assume everyone has read our analysis, which goes through the definition of lot. Because what's important is sign allotment in your ordinance. It's section, let's see here. Section 1111. There's a sign allotment in section F. It says sign allotment in signal business located on one parcel. And it describes the signage we believe that each business is entitled to. To walk it backwards again, parcel's not defined in the ordinance, but lot is. And if you look at the definition of lot, that includes a condominium unit, which these are. Therefore, it makes logical sense that a legal description of the tax parcel ID is entitled to their own separate rights for lot assignment, sign allotment assignments, and all others. They are individual legal rights that are bound by a myriad of, in this case, could be 13 separate owners, not one general ownership. This is consistent with your Indian Hills development and the Walmart development, both distinctly different in the fact that one is individual businesses, buildings, and one is one building with multiple tenants in it with different sets of ownership. Both of those signs exceed the height, size requirements of this ordinance, and were approved by this township before. So it's consistent. We think that what we're trying to do is consistent with what has been done before in the language of the ordinance. That is the specific interpretation request. We're entitled to this allotment of signs. That's exactly what we thought was intended in the January 2nd meeting we had with this Board of Appeals originally, and that was the directive we sought and followed through with. Once we have that understanding, then we are suggesting that that total amount of signage, the square footage, be divvied up in fewer signs. We're going to eliminate a couple signs, we're going to add a couple, but it would be, much fewer than 13 signs. And our design plans were included, obviously, in here. But the square footage would not exceed what we would be allocated under the individual allotments. So with that, I guess I would leave it up to you guys on the text interpretation for questions, clarifications that you may have to get to where we are going on this particular matter, while supplementing what we've already provided you in our application.
Anyone have any specific questions for the applicant at this time? Thank you. If we have other questions, I may call you back up.
Sure.
I'm going to open the discussion since I was, in fact, I believe the only member of the ZBA present at that previously mentioned meeting. The condominium question came up and was discussed, as the applicant indicated, at length. And given some of the difficulties with our our definitions. It does, that's a valid question. I think the condominium piece is a valid question based on 3.41 lot definition, and it's listed there, section C, in the case of division of land based on the basis of condominium ownership, site condominium lot shall also include the portion of the condominium project designed and intended for separate ownership as use as described in the master deed. That was the basis of our discussion and recommendation, that simply having a tenant in a larger building didn't constitute that tenant to have rights to the lot. However, when that tenant owns its own individual piece of that building, or in this case, of that parcel with its own property designation, it was a consideration that wasn't available to us at the time. So I'm open to hearing any further discussion, but that's kind of the backstory here. So.
Well, I think that there's a lot of people that confuse condominiums with brick and mortar, and condominium really is a division of property, but it has nothing to do with what's built on it. It's a separation of one entire piece. There's a common area and a limited common area. But each space is its own individual property, and it should be treated that way, in my opinion.
So as a reminder to the members of the board, in order to make a determination here, we are obligated to follow section 5.8, section C, item 1, A through E. So when we're looking to make a decision or a recommendation, we want to be looking to those specific items. Coincidentally, those are the items that the applicant has addressed in multiple pieces of their correspondence. But sometimes it's helpful, and we've done this in the past, where we will take a look at the question at hand and then simply run through and answer those particular items to try and derive an answer. But I appreciate Jim's comment. I don't know if anybody, Judy or Liz or Ryan, anybody have any other discussion?
I would just kind of echo what Jim was saying, and I think if we go through, I think I like that idea of kind of going through these one by one. I think that's kind of a helpful exercise.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, may I offer a comment before we proceed further?
Sure.
Thank you. I'm not an attorney. I don't want to give any illusion that I'm offering legal advice. But I do want to make sure to make one comment regarding the construction. Looking at the definition of lot, the gentleman provided in his letter quoted, really, as he said, the definition of lot is really key to all of what we're discussing tonight. And he provided in his letter a quoted definition several times. Each of the letters quotes the definition from the ordinance. But in the quote, in each letter, there are these 4 dots. There should be 3, but there are 4 dots. And those 4 dots really, where text is missing, where he edited down the definition to get from the beginning statement about lot to the key part in C that he's concerned about. He left out some significant elements that I would just want to make sure get considered as you're looking at this interpretation. The subsection C, that provision related to condominiums, does not alter or negate the characteristics of a lot that are discussed and defined in the first part of that definition. He read the whole definition tonight, but it's not included in any of his letters. A lot is of at least sufficient size to meet the minimum requirements for use for coverage. That's lot coverage. That's the percentage of the lot that can be covered with structures. Each district has a percentage, whether it's 25% or 30 or 50%. It limits how much of the lot can be covered with structures. Also, it has to meet the minimum lot area requirements for the zoning district. It also has to provide sufficient area for the setbacks. That's all of the front, side, and rear yard setbacks, and for any open space required by the ordinance. And to be a lot under this definition, it has to have frontage on a street or road right-of-way. The condominium units that we're discussing tonight are in each case a subdivision of the building that is on the land. So the question for you is, do those condominium units meet these characteristics that are in the first part of that lot definition? Subsection C does not negate in any way what's in that first part. The characteristic of a lot still has to have all these characteristics, including meeting the lot area requirement, frontage on a road or street, and have sufficient area for setbacks and required open space.
Thank you, Director.
I'm sorry, who are you?
I apologize you came in late. My name is Rodney Nanny. I'm the Director of the Community and Economic Development Department. I just started this month.
Okay.
Township staff. Okay,
May I respond?
sure.
I intentionally did not include the other portions of that definition because they aren't applicable. They describe things which are important. The last sentence of that paragraph, and I don't want to get the semantics here, but it says, and may consist of, it's in addition to, as separate items, these other types of qualifications of lots. And I would ask your staff, take the Condominium Act and tell me where it's different. Where in there is there a separation of structure or land defining a condominium as two different types of condominiums? One type, one unit, one legal description. There's no legal, he's absolutely right, he's not an attorney, but you guys have the opportunity to get, those interpretations. There is not a single set of case law or language in the Condominium Act that separates land from structure. It acknowledges the uniqueness of a condominium. There can be structures that have, an 84th floor building has separate legal descriptions. Every level can be owned by a different company or a different entity. And they're entitled to their property rights as a result of that. That's the unique thing about condos. That's why they're a different type of development than a plat. That's why they're a different type of development than a lot. That's why that language says it may consist of. You guys don't define condominiums any different. That language in C is verbatim the language in the Condominium Act. I'm going to read it. Condominium. Condominium unit means that portion of the condominium project designed and intended for separate ownership and use as described in the master deed, regardless of whether it is intended for residential, office, industrial, business, recreational use, is a timeshare unit, or any other use. That's the state act. There is no separate definition. The township may want to interpret it that way, and that's the whole problem we have, is that they've interpreted it that way. There just isn't a separate thing. And if there isn't, then why are condominium units even allowed? I mean, does that mean that you separate the type of condominium unit rights? And I think it's important to note that the Condominium Act says you can't treat condominiums different than any other type of ownership of land. And we cite that. It's why it's unique. It's different than a plot. It's different than a parcel, in the sense that it's a type of ownership. So I get that they want to interpret it that way, and that's fine, but that's just simply not how it is. The law doesn't provide for it. The Condominium Act doesn't provide for it. The ordinance doesn't provide for it. This is literally the only definition that we have to work with. And your definition would be consistent with the Condominium Act as we interpret it. So I just think that's a logical way to go. I don't want to belabor it, but I just think that that's the issue, is that nuance. It is uniquely different. So,
Thank you. Anyone have any other questions before we continue? There's several items here that we need to address. I'd like to take them individually, just to kind of regain our focus here. This obviously is not a court of law, so the legalese can get confusing at times, but I think we can very simply go down the list and follow along those guidelines in 5.8C 1, A through E, and that'll help derive a discussion and potentially even a motion. So we're going to first tackle the interpretation of text.
Before we start that, Just for my own edification, would it be possible to see, and I apologize, I came straight from the office here, but would it be possible if Peter were to pull up the full description of the parcel definition, just for all of us to see and read?
Yeah, I came from home too, so. I don't
Well,
know.
so for those that have their, and I can give you my copy, Ryan. So section 3.41, for those that have their copy of the zoning ordinance with them, this is found on page 3-11, under definitions, 3.41 lot. A lot is a parcel of land of at least sufficient size to meet minimum requirements for use, coverage, and lot area adequate to provide such setback area and other open space as required by this ordinance. Such lots shall have frontage on a designated street, road right-of-way, or easement, and may consist of a measured portion of a parcel or tract of land that is described and fixed in a recorded plat. B, a parcel or tract of land contiguous area described by meets and bounds. C, in the case of division of land on the basis of condominium ownership, site condominium, lot shall also include the portion of the condominium project designed and intended for separate ownership and use as described in the master deed. That's what 3.41 lot says.
Does that help, Brian?
Kind of.
So just before we go, I did want to, I just want to add on to a little bit of what's been said. And so as far as my first recommendation to you about the administrative review and text interpretation, perhaps it would be better suited that in the future I would put those perhaps in key findings. Basically, I was giving you my, since it's reviewing the administrative review, my decision, how I came to that decision, and so that I wasn't just, making it on the fly. So that was basically more given a background for you guys as to why I arrived at the decision that I did. Secondly, section 5.8C, that is for how we arrive to a variance. And so when we're looking at the variance application, we'll want to look at 5.8C, but that criteria is not, you don't follow that outline when you're doing a text interpretation or administrative review. You'd want to look at the actual, when you're looking at the administrative review, text interpretation, you'd want to look at the sections of the ordinance, specifically one of the big ones, this section 3.41. And so the section 5.8C isn't going to necessarily help you when you're doing the administrative review or the text interpretation.
Thank you, Peter. So, if anyone has any objection, let me know, but my intent would be to move down the list A, B, and C, so we first deal with the interpretation of text. So if we look at that in itself, we're talking about specifically the section 3.41 that we've read, that definition of land, or lot, rather. And I have a very clear opinion that the section C does in fact offer us some latitude that once condominiumized, those particular properties are guaranteed rights similar to those that are on a piece of land. Unfortunately, that may not be consistent with, it's going to be inconsistent with one side in this discussion, whether it's Peter's interpretation or the applicant, but that's just my personal opinion, so I'm interested to hear the rest of the board, or if someone feels strongly about it and would like to make a motion. So,
I would certainly concur with what you're saying, Andy, that, I mean, it's clear to me that condominium creates separate, not lots, but it designates a division in the property. And they're to be treated individually, in my opinion.
I would agree. I think it sets a precedent that I don't know that we would want to set, that if they were all considered the same, just because they're on the same piece of land, I think they're all granted their own individual rights. And I agree, I think just that C is kind of where I read that, so.
Does anyone feel compelled to make a motion or have further discussion?
I don't know as I see C as being incompatible with point number 1. I mean, from a legal perspective, for right or for wrong, I mean, I guess when I'm reading that, the way that's written, it's saying that the Part C has to adhere to number 1. Number 1 governs each of the A, B, and C. Again, whether that is, passes muster as it relates to, the state of Michigan's legal requirements or any case law, I don't know. But if I'm reading it, it seems to me that it's stating these are the types of lots that adhere to this standard number 1.
One of the things that I found helpful when considering this application, and I'm going to skip ahead here, so if you've got your book with you, if you move into section 11, this kind of solidified my thought process on this. Section 11, and it's page 4 of 23, shows an illustration for a principal building frontage and a street. So if we look at what the applicant is proposing, it appears as though these individual condominiums, albeit in one building, still in fact do have frontage on the respective street. So just by way of using the illustration, we can see that there is a principal building. However, you slice that up, there's individual frontages that would dictate some of those sign allotments. So I think it's consistent throughout our ordinance in several spots. But the piece of the lot definition I think that's critical to consider is, and I'm going to read the last sentence just because we've read this multiple times, but the last sentence of that first paragraph of the definition says, such lots shall have frontage on a designated street, road right-of-way, or easement, and may consist of. So Ryan's right. I think your interpretation that opening paragraph is key. But it then also says, and may consist of, and that's when C comes into play, because it's not saying that it has to have all of these things. It may consist of the other, but again, that's my interpretation. So I would like to get a motion if we could.
I would like to, I don't have the language because I don't have all my documents, but I would like to move to agree with, to disagree with Peter and agree with the applicant. And I don't know, I don't have the language with me to,
I believe the interpretation, we're looking for a motion that would reference the interpretation of the definition of a lot and the allowance of a condominium, a portion of the condominium project to constitute sign rights, something to that effect.
okay, I would move that we approve the applicant's interpretation of our zoning book based on 3.41C in the case of the land division based condominium, site condominium, the lot shall also include a portion of the condominium project intended for separate ownership as described in the master deed.
So we have a motion by Jim. Do we have a second?
I second.
Second by Liz. Any discussion?
Chair, could I just add one comment?
Yes.
So so it's the interpretation, and this is why we have these. Everyone has their interpretation. What I did just want to mention is that the applicant had brought up the Indian Hills Encore Plaza, where we have these multiple stores, even Indian Hills, where they're in one large building and each has its own unit, and you have their individual store. Indian Hills Plaza still only has the one freestanding sign. Yes, each unit is allowed its own wall sign, but if you were to take the interpretation that if it's condomized and each has its own lot, I suppose, as the applicant would say, this would allow each one of these stores to have one of their own freestanding signs. And so when you look at the intent of our sign ordinance, when you go through the township and you think about these places where there's only existing one freestanding sign, if we were to interpret it the other way, you would see each one of those stores having the right to put their own freestanding sign without a variance on those parcels. And so I would think that would be a proliferation of signs that is not what the sign ordinance intends. So again, it's your own it's your interpretation, but I just want to let you know that this was that's what it could open the door up to.
Indian Hills is a shopping center owned by one group that leases space to individual stores. I mean, that's totally different than a condominium.
I don't want to get sidetracked here,
But would allow us
So.
individual signs.
Pardon me?
The rights to.
Ronnie, thank you. So we have a motion, we have a second. I'll take discussion at this point, not from township staff, but just from the voting members of the board.
What's the difference between a lease and an ownership? I mean, if we're trying to compare it to Indian Hills, and who's to say that somebody who owns the entire building, could they sell a leased portion?
That's literally the basis of the Condominium Act, because that's the whole point of condominiumizing it, so that it can be separate and owned individually. If it's leased, then there wouldn't be individual parcels. There would be a single parcel, or maybe several parcels that are owned by one entity who owns that outside lot. So an individual tenant would only be allowed tenant rights based on the total for that particular site. That would be my interpretation of it.
My question is, can a developer choose after they have leased these sites?
They'd
Can they
have to
choose?
condominiumize the property. They'd have to go through the Condominium Act, condominiumize it. They would have to go.
Okay.
They'd have to come back to the township and say, we want to turn this into a condominium and go through the process.
Mhm.
But each condominium is taxed separately. I mean, it's like Indian Hills Plaza, this one big tax bill comes to the, now everybody may pay a portion of it, but it all comes to Academy developers or whoever the developer is.
Yeah, I get that.
Then now we're getting off into individual lease terms and things that are part of a lease agreement, as opposed to what's allowed in the ordinance.
Right, but if we're having a conversation about how we're interpreting this, are we comfortable with interpreting it that way, and then saying if anybody else that wants to condominiumize a development, we're comfortable with them giving each condominium a freestanding sign?
No, and I think that's part of the discussion that I want to get to, because we're taking these one at a time. We're interpreting the text, then we have the administrative review, and then we have the variance. So in the end, there still has to be a request, because we can interpret and side with the applicant in saying that a condominium, in the way that they've created it, would constitute allowance for certain things, but then they would still have to meet all these criteria. And then we can tackle that individually with every application that comes up.
I'm not trying to disagree. If you interpret so for the example of the freestanding signs, if you interpret that each individual unit is its own lot, they're entitled to a freestanding sign, the applicant does not need a variance for that freestanding sign. They're allowed to apply for a freestanding sign, and as long as they meet the size requirements, they're allowed to have that freestanding sign. So if we interpret it that they are their own lot, the variance for additional freestanding signs is no longer needed.
Okay, we have a motion and we have a second. For the record, There was some discussion when it happened, but Jim came in as an alternate, so we are seated with a full board. So what I would like to do is make a vote on the motion at hand and then see where we're at with that. So we have an interpretation to side with the fact that a condominium has certain rights to receive signage, and we have a motion and a second. At this time, I would like to call a vote. All those in favor of that motion, aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
Aye.
We have a 4-1. Motion carries for interpretation of the condominium sign rights as a abbreviated version of Jim's motion. Jennifer, do you have the language you need for that? That's item A. Item B is the administrative review. So, looking at the administrative review, Peter, do you want to give us the language for that one more time, since we went over that quite some time ago? I think it would be helpful for you to reread the language for the administrative review.
In my memo, or?
Yes,
the-
please.
If I may, Chair. With the text interpretation, the administrative review would essentially be a moot point. So I don't think we have to belabor that issue. We could go right into we'll withdraw that request consistent
you.
with the text interpretation. We'll go ahead with the variance. Thanks.
The applicant has withdrawn the administrative review, PZA 20-02. Moving on to variance 20-01, variance request. Now we're going to get into kind of the details of the sign requests as they've been presented, which again, as Peter mentioned, this would be the time in which we would be utilizing section 5.8 C1 A through E to make a determination. The applicant has provided quite a lot of detail in their submittal, which is helpful to interpret what they're intending to do. I would like the applicant to come up and explain the drawings. Is this Tim or Mark, somebody?
This is a little bit of where I don't have the expertise, and we may have our group here put together some information regarding the dimensional issues, but I think the key issue is we acknowledge that there's these freestanding and wall signs rights allocated to each unit, and they do have their allocated frontage. And so we went through the calculations, and we calculated the total square footage that would be allowed on the site related to those 13 units. We also acknowledge that that is not attractive looking, nor really fits into the nature of the clustering intensity of the signage that is really what I think your ordinance is hoping for. So we've proposed not to exceed the square footage allocated, but proposed fewer signs with the specifics. On this page here, the right-hand side is the breakdown of how we think we can do it that makes some sense. It actually makes it a little more attractive. There are a couple really small signs, just more of directional signs, so they won't necessarily be part of a large, sign. On the left, you see that chart, and that's the calculation. And we go through I did, Tim and his staff did, a painful calculation process that you guys saw in there, which is each unit's size and definition. So the intent of this design is to concentrate signage, not utilize the full breadth of signage available to us to make it look more attractive. And I would note that we include, eliminating, I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 signs that are currently there to accommodate that, so that we're not adding to the existing signs. We're actually going to take 2? One away. So, dimensionally, design-wise, if you have questions, I would defer to Tim on that. His staff did a really nice job. Hopefully you got the colored renderings that show the design. So the variance request is to go from the freestanding to the cluster style, kind of a hybrid between them. kind of acknowledging the spirit of the ordinance related to the clustering, but without having each individual sign out there. We have a couple. We're trying to make it an attractive entrance-style signage. So if you have specific questions, I'll go ahead and go through those. And you have our interpretation of each particular code in our letter. So we go through that breakdown, we give you the reason why we think that under Section C, why we need it.
Can Tim come to the mic?
Yes, sir.
So this plan, your sign plan is less than the allowed,
No, so it is exactly the same.
exactly the same, so
So what you have on the left-hand side is going through unit by unit, taking the condominium plans themselves that showed the units and the dimensioning, going through and determining how much wall sign, how much freestanding sign each unit would be allowed. That comes down to a total, which is based on your interpretation, then each individual is allowed to look at their width of building, width, height, depth, and correspond to the sign ordinance. So those are the totals that I worked out. It came down to 1,294 square feet of wall signage and 941 feet of freestanding signage. Then you go to the right side and taking those square footages and divvying them up as it's shown, that's what we would be showing. So you've got proposed freestanding signs. You've got two that are the similar to like what's at Bluegrass and Encore. You've got two looking at that. They're 15 foot by 20 foot, so for a total of 300 square feet for each sign. Two signs, that's 600 square feet. There's two individual freestanding that would be allowed, that would meet the height requirements of 16 feet. And they're each a total of 90 square feet. Then you have on Jens Way, the existing panel sign at the entrance coming into the building, that sign would stay. Then at the very back, where Jens Way comes and meets Lexi Lane, which is going around the very south side, there would be a small placard sign on a monument sign that would direct back towards where the mini storages are. So there's those for the freestanding signs. If you add up the totals, they'll come to 941. Proposed wall signs, similar to the corner that you see with McGurk Sand and Gravels. That was 150 square foot because it was at the corner. In the end, this development will have corners like that in 4 different locations. So we're looking at 150 square feet at those 4 corners. Then the rest of it is how the signage would be broken up between those facing Remus Road, Jens Way, and Lexi Lane. And again, those totals add up to 1,290.
So, but the totals add up to what's allowed
That's
in this
correct.
district.
Yep,
And
we're
you've-
not asking for anything
You've
more.
done, rather than have individual signs, you've clustered them
Yes.
for the most part. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, they're in there.
So you guys have obviously spent far more time looking at this than we have, which is not to say that we haven't, but you've thought about this and laid these out. If we're following along, it appears that the early pages 1, 2, 3 are indicating what you would be allowed based on the interpretation, which would be a
Right.
large quantity of freestanding signs,
Right.
which,
That was put together basically to show if the interpretation were to be approved, that's technically what could be done. that's not what anybody wants to see.
That's good.
So
Very good.
the next portion is,
Give us a reference of page number, please.
schematic design, 3, proposed signage. I'm not sure.
I think for us, it starts at page 6.
That's what I was thinking.
It cuts from.
Page 6.
Schematic 3D views, proposed signage, page 6.
Right. And to give you a better feel, if you go back to the last page. The large combined signs. That gives you the idea of the single standing 90 square foot versus the development signs that would have placards within advertising the people that are within the development.
So based on that proposal, looking at page 6, in the Remus Road looking west view, or the top left view, if you can get to that, Peter.
Okay.
There's reference to a future boulevard entrance with sign location to be determined. What
Yes.
is that currently does not have access?
Yeah, that's correct. There's the possibility of having the parcels to the west. There's the abandoned houses that are in there. There's 2 abandoned houses where Mr. Peters has his, or had his office. I think he's either moving out or has moved out. But those properties are going to, are B5 parcels. And looking at a common entrance down there, having access on the westerly side of the development.
Is the existing Westwood Acres sign on Lincoln to remain?
On Lincoln, yes, the existing one on Remus would not.
Would be
That have
replaced,
to be
which is
removed.
what's illustrated. And then in this view, on the top left, we're seeing 2 additional signs in between the 2 proposed clustered signs.
Right.
One of 90, I think it was 90 square
Both of
feet.
them 90.
Both 90. Is it safe to say that those proposed are for those, that tenant, for example, Peterbilt?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we've heard from the applicant regarding these signs and the requested variance. I had not taken the time to calculate those numbers, so in interest of making sure those numbers are accurate, any motion we make, I would like to suggest that we have some conditions that would state that Peter would be verifying compliance with the ordinance for all those specific sizes. So I think that would be critical, and I would want to err on the side of caution. So just as a reminder to everyone, I would like to include that as a condition if you were interested in accepting that in a motion.
I would move that we approve the variance to McGurk Mini Storage based on the fact that it does not exceed the allowable amount of square footage for signs, and make this subject to an audit by staff on the calculations that we voted on, or that we talked about tonight, so.
So we're kind of jumping ahead here, so before we take that motion, Jim, I'd like to remind everybody to jump back to 5.8, because I would like to go through these criteria, and I think then we can decide whether or not there's a motion that's available to be made. In the past, Peter's helped facilitate that, and if everyone's comfortable with that, I'm going to let Peter run through those individual items, and then give us a chance to kind of respond and answer that. Peter, if you don't mind doing that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Before we begin, just so I know exactly what the variance is, I'm going to refer up to here. So the variance that, Jim, you're mentioning is to have a freestanding sign here, a freestanding sign showing as here, and then these two freestanding signs? Is that the variance that you're
It also
referring
is
to?
a directional sign, it looks like.
And yeah, let me make sure. So it's referenced on page 6, and then we have this existing sign.
That's correct.
So
And then in the background, on the next sheet, I think you'll see the directional sign there.
okay, so this in addition. So page 6 and page 9. Okay.
So Jim, I'm not going to accept that motion right now until we go through the rest of these criteria. So there is no motion currently on the table until we get through these. I'll ask for a motion once we've gone through the criteria.
So section 5.8C, 1, a variance from the terms of this ordinance shall not be granted by the Board of Appeals unless and until a written application for a variance is submitted demonstrating A, that special conditions and circumstances exist that are peculiar to the land, structure, or building involved that are not applicable to other lands, structures, or buildings in the same zoning district. So this is a B5 district. So when you look at other B5 districts, the special conditions and circumstances exist that are peculiar to this land, structure, or building involved that are not applicable to other lands, structures, or buildings in the same zoning district, in this case B5. So are there special conditions or circumstances that exist to this B5 zoned property, land, structure, or building that are not applicable when you look at other lands, structures, or buildings in a B5 district?
I guess I don't even know why they need a variance. It looks like.
I was gonna say, I don't, because at this point, are we talking about a variance for, because if we've already interpreted the text that they're each allowed their own sign, are we looking for a variance to go from the 13 individual signs to this number of signs?
Well,
So
so,
instead of them,
and the applicant can, if you need them, but let
We
me.
need to do that, and we'll have to make a motion on that, because if we didn't, we'd walk out of here tonight and we'd see 13 freestanding signs.
right,
tomorrow.
no, I think it's
That's-
important,
that's
I
what's
just was
critical
trying to
this.
get my head around and separating the variance from the text interpretation.
So, for example, the interpretation allows each unit to have its own freestanding sign. The freestanding sign, for example, is maxed out at 16 feet in height. The applicant is asking for a sign that exceeds that, 20 feet in height, as listed. And so they're, instead of seeking just the 13 units, each 13 unit gets its own freestanding sign that meets the height requirement, square footage requirement. They are asking for, in this case, a larger sign, and if we go to page 6, and this is where the applicant larger sign here, a larger sign there. These signs, if they're 90 square feet, 16 feet in height, represent their own unit with 90, at least 90 lineal feet, then those would be permitted. But these signs with the size would be larger, so the variance would be, you would need a variance for this size of signs.
I see what you're saying. So is it a special condition that there are these 13 condominiums within this one piece of land that I guess I'm struggling with how to make it a special condition, but it would be more appealing to have this than 13 individual signs.
So I think the variance basically is for the sign size.
It is for the size and quantity.
But why is it different than other similar lots or parcels of land? Isn't that the first, what Peter
Correct.
just read?
That's, we have to make a determination on that. And the answer to that is everyone's subjective opinion of that. Is there a special condition or circumstance that exists peculiar to the land structure or building involved that are not applicable to other land structures or buildings?
Is there?
I'm honestly struggling with it because it is condominiumized, but that can happen to any other
Right.
parcel of land or structures in a similar zoning district.
I think it's a larger condominium project than we typically have in Union Township. I don't know if there's another one, Zone B5. I mean, there's other condominium projects, but I mean, this is a pretty extensive development here.
So you're saying that you think the special condition or circumstance would be that the scale of the project?
Scale of the project.
Okay,
And, you know, it's not like 3 residential condominiums that take up 100 square feet of frontage. I mean, this is significant.
can we come back to that right now? We've got Jim's opinion of scale. You want to continue to discuss that, or can we move on to B? I'd like to take them in their totality. I think that'll help make a
Sure.
determination.
So again, a variance from the terms of this ordinance shall not be granted by the Board of Appeals unless and until a written application for variance is submitted demonstrating B, that literal interpretation of the provisions of this ordinance would deprive the applicant of rights commonly enjoyed by other properties in the same zoning district under the terms of this ordinance. Again, this is a B5 parcel. So would a literal interpretation that you take of the provisions of this ordinance, would that deprive the applicant of rights commonly enjoyed by other properties in the same zoning district, a B5? Again, a variance is an exception to the zoning ordinance. So if you were to do a literal interpretation of the provisions, would that deprive the applicant of rights commonly enjoyed by other properties in the same zoning district, B5?
Well, I don't think,
I don't see how there would be any denial of rights.
no. So we'd move on to C.
C, that the special conditions and circumstances do not result from the actions of the applicant. This ties in with what, if you find with A, when you are asked to discover if there are special conditions and circumstances that exist that are peculiar to the land, structure, or building involved, as stated in A, C says that the special conditions and circumstances do not result from the actions of the applicant.
This is one that I often struggle with personally, because if we were to use, this is why I wanted to go through them in their totality, because if we use Jim's synopsis of A, that it's a large-scale development, I mean, the special conditions and circumstances are a direct result of the owner purchasing a large-scale property and developing it, but I don't view that as a negative impact to the community. It seems like it's a large piece that wasn't previously being used, therefore it would be not a negative item here. But
I don't think we have another B5 condominium project, commercial project in this township. I certainly don't know where it would be.
Well, it certainly wouldn't preclude us from having one. I mean,
No, but I mean, it's, so we can't compare it to anything else because there is nothing else like this, is what I'm saying.
I guess if I'm reading, I mean, if I'm interpreting what the ordinance says, the ordinance is, I mean, simply by virtue of the size of the parcel, I'm not sure that it necessarily conflicts with what's written in Section A. It's, you know, any other developer could come in with the right to develop the same size parcel, the same condominiumized lots or structures. I'm not sure how what we're talking about here is any different than that.
Let's circle back on C. Let's move to D right now.
So D, a variance from the terms of this ordinance shall not be granted by the Board of Appeals unless and until a written application for a variance is submitted demonstrating D, that granting the variance requested will not confer on the applicant any special privilege that is denied by this ordinance to other lands, structures, or buildings in the same zoning district. So that would granting this variance confer any kind of special privilege that is denied by this ordinance to other lands, structures, or buildings in the same zoning district, a B5.
Again, I don't think there is another B5 commercial condominium development. I mean, we're trying to compare something that doesn't exist. This would be what somebody in the future could compare it to, but at this point, there's nothing like this out there that I can think of, unless you can come up with something, Peter.
Well, as far as where I'm going at, and I can give my thoughts on it after we get through E, but does anybody want to say anything else or move on to E?
Let's move to E.
Okay. A variance from the terms of this ordinance shall not be granted by the Board of Appeals unless and until a written application for a variance is submitted demonstrating E, no non-conforming use of neighboring lands, structures, or buildings in the same zoning district, and no permitted use of lands, structures, or buildings in other zoning districts shall be considered grounds for the issuance of a variance. To help clarify with E, the first part where it says no non-conforming use of neighboring lands, structures, or buildings in the same zoning district, that is referring to if you have an existing structure, land, or building that does not meet the zoning standards of the zoning ordinance, it would become non-conforming. And so, for example, you can't say, well, that non-conforming structure or
Land and building.
land or building in that B5 district over there allows what I want, therefore you have to give it to me. The answer to that is no. In addition, and no permitted use of land, structures, or buildings in other zoning districts shall be considered grounds for issuance of a variance. For example, this property is B5. If the applicant were to say, well, look over there at the B6 parcel next door and I'm not saying there is a B6 parcel, but say, well, they have it in the B6, therefore you should allow me to do in a B5 what they can do in a B6. The answer to that would be no. You would not be able to issue a variance on those grounds.
So I don't think that we're issuing a variance based on referencing another parcel. There's been discussion of other parcels in town to give, I think, context, but I don't think anybody's proposing to use those particular properties as a means to grant a variance. So I think we need to circle back to A, because that's really going to be the basis of all of this. We can move from A to B to C to D again, but the question I think that we're going to need to start with is, are there special conditions and circumstances? Jim has indicated he thinks that the scale of the development is a special circumstance. I'd like to entertain the discussion on that before we go through the exercise of motions and motions and motions. So, Judy, do you have any?
I'd agree with that. The scale of it would.
I mean, I think the fact that if there are no other B5s that look like that, that alone makes it kind of a special circumstance. And I think certainly if you were to, since we've already interpreted the text the way we have, if we are not considering it that a special condition, then you're going to have the 13 signs there together, which I think we'd rather, I would imagine, based on the other conditions of signage, move in the direction of creating a precedent that is more visually appealing than that.
Ryan?
I mean, we've boxed ourselves in at this point. There's nothing we can do. Nobody wants to have 13 signs out there, but, so, I mean, we've already interpreted the ordinance to read as such. So, I mean, no, I don't agree that scale creates any special condition, but at the same time, I don't want 13 signs. So, we boxed ourselves in.
So if we consider A and we say that the scale of the development is not a special condition or circumstance, then it stops right there, and now we're back to square one, and we're gonna have to have a discussion about the individual number of signs coming, and I agree. Your statement that we've boxed ourselves in is one interpretation of the circumstances. The question then of C, whether or not the special conditions and circumstances result as from the actions of the applicant. Again, I think that's difficult to.
I don't think they result from the actions of the applicant, no.
Okay. The parcel exists and.
Parcel exists. I mean, they've been allowed to develop there, and they've developed as such.
And do we believe that the literal interpretation of the provisions of this ordinance would deprive the applicant of rights commonly enjoyed by other properties? I don't think so.
I don't think we say that either.
So, D, granting the variance request will not confer on the applicant any special privilege. This is always one that I've struggled with because I think that's exactly what a variance is, right? It is a deviation from what the ordinance
But it
dictates.
doesn't grant any special privilege.
No, it's not a special privilege. It is in fact a variance, and so
Yeah, it's a variance.
I don't
It's-
believe it's a special privilege. It's just simply a variance, and it's a caveat that I think is important to mention. It's not special privilege. It's just that of a variance. So I don't know where everyone's opinion is at, but what I'd like to see is that we establish a couple conditions to this. If we're, I think we know where Jim's headed when I call for a motion. Jim's going to be looking to make a motion, but I think it's important to make some conditions of the approval. One of the things that's jumping out at me is I don't want this motion to be at all tied to this future boulevard entrance with a sign location to be determined, because that's talking about a piece of property that is currently not on this parcel, or if it in fact is proposing the sign location to be on the parcel, it's still to be determined. So I don't particularly feel comfortable at all.
That's undeveloped
approving that.
property, that's still gotta come back through the whole plan.
What the sign location says to be determined, so I think it's important to exclude that particular sign from the motion as a condition. That's one of the things that I'm seeing. I don't know if there's any other discussion of particular conditions or questions that anybody has.
Just the audit of the square footage. It's
Pardon?
the audit of the
Yep.
square footage.
Yep, the audit of the square footage. And if anyone agrees about elimination of that other proposed sign for the future boulevard entrance, I don't feel comfortable about a signage for a future boulevard entrance.
I agree.
To the point of your audit, Jim, and I can go to this to make sure, and if you look at, and this is where I had the discrepancy, so in the signage per ordinance on the cover page, and it lists units 1 through 13. Unit 4, it states the wall signage 150 square feet, freestanding signage 94 square feet. So you go to, actually have to go to in your list of individual applications that they have listed as units 1 and through 13, if you look at application unit 4, so it's stating 94, I guess, .13 total lineal for second floor, 48, .89 total for first floor. But the way that wall signage is permitted. And when I looked at this, I looked at it as a integrated groups wall signage. It states wall signage is permitted at the rate of 1 square foot of signage for each lineal foot of building frontage, depth or height, whichever is greater, each user occupies on the address side. Signage not to exceed 100 square feet. And so what that is stating, that is, even if you have the 150 lineal feet frontage, depth, or height, you can't exceed 100 square feet. And so that is where the that within Unit 4, and I believe it was Unit 10, and so that's where I picked up the discrepancy of perhaps that the tables were switched, misaligned.
If staff is going to be able to talk about my calculations, can I?
We don't have a motion, we don't have anything on the table. We're going to refer to that as an audit as part of a motion if the motion is.
Yeah, I guess why are we auditing now?
Correct, that was the purpose of that audit, so.
Well, we're gonna get into another interpretation, but it's corner lot.
So
Read your ordinance.
when we've talked about our points here on 5.8C, A through E. At this point, if there's no further discussion, I'd like to entertain a motion.
I would move that.
To clarify as the applicant, some of the exclusionary sections that were discussed for clarification purposes on the future sign, I think would be helpful. That sign is to be utilized by those units 13. And we're willing to say that this was the intent, was to be utilized by those units, and it's on this condominium project. It's on the land of that condominium project. So, you know, the hope that we could use it in the future would be great if we ended up having more tenants, but the important thing here is that if we need to condition it, that it's got to be utilized for the tenants within that existing condominium project, and that it be on the land where we're trying to make that clarification. So we prefer not to have it excluded, because then we would eliminate 600 square feet of our requested signage. Or 300, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chair, may I ask one quick, just clarifying question? There's been a lot of discussion about the sign area, the number of signs. There's not been any discussion about the sign height variance. They're asking for 17 additional feet in height for this new Boulevard entrance sign. And there's not been any discussion over whether that additional height meets the criteria for variance.
Okay.
Certainly, an alternative would be to simply have a 300 square foot sign that was 16 feet tall, so it would meet the height standard.
Sure. The reason we don't have that is, one, you can't see through it for safety purposes if it's all the way to the ground, and you can't have a clear vision area of those intersections, so you have it raised. So we're just acknowledging the practical implications of having a sign that would be 15 by 20 or 15 by 16 or whatever, 300 square feet, all the way down to the ground, and also get our square footage. It's a safety consideration.
I would, at this point, I'd still like to entertain a motion, and then we can work through the specifics of the clarifications.
Move that we approve the variance by McGurkman Storage based on the scale of the development and the fact that we are not exceeding any of the sign requirements for the proposed signage.
So with that motion, is there a second?
I second.
I have a motion, I have a second. Now we have to have some discussion, and I want to point out, Jim, that you're saying it would all comply, and what they've asked for will not comply. So the variance is for them to cluster. So if you want them to be allowed, I think it's important to clarify that, because that speaks to the idea of a sign that's nearly double the allotted.
That, based on the fact that they're going to use the correct square footage in a cluster formation that we allow. That and based on the fact that we have or that Peter can audit square footage.
So, are you making an amendment to that motion?
Yes.
There's been an amendment to the motion. Liz, you seconded. Did you agree with that amendment?
Yes. Agreed.
Judy,
And
any
the
discussion?
caveat is, they're not gonna be able to go back to 13 signs down the road. We're limiting it to a certain number of signs, but we're letting them be higher.
Why would they not be able to go back to 13 signs?
We could make that a condition of this
That's what I
approval.
wondered if it should be a condition. Because
I
you're
like
giving
that, I
them
think
variance,
so.
you have to tell them.
I think we're allowing them to do this, not allowing them to do any other configuration. This is what we're saying they can do.
So this would dictate future signage.
Signage couldn't be one per unit because we've given them a variance for these, and because of, to me aesthetically, 13 signs looks,
I think that's a good point.
that we limit it to not increase.
But I think that would require, if they do anything other than this, then they're gonna have to come back through the whole process again. I don't think we can, we're gonna end up with a book trying to regulate what they cannot do in the future. That has to be brought back in front of the boards here. But what we're approving is what we've seen here.
And wouldn't the square footage allowance be maximized here?
It's exceeded.
So then they wouldn't be able to do the additional signs without an additional variance, right?
Yeah, I think it would be important to set that as a condition, because they're saying that they acknowledge 13 individual signs would not be aesthetically pleasing or appropriate, and so they've put them together in these configurations that are shown. I think it would be critical to offer that approval, and that they be limited to the signs that are here.
Right.
As presented, so that in the future, tomorrow, we don't end up with a bunch of individual signs
That's
coming
good,
for
yeah.
all of these, including the new entrance signs.
Yeah.
So bear with me for a second. So what does this variance mean for the next condominiumized development that comes along like this? What does that mean for that? Would somebody, the next developer, come along and have to ask for the same variance, or would there be a precedent for to say, well, we don't want to do that, but we can do this because you already allowed it?
Each individual case is heard on its own merit, and so precedence for an existing condition is not grounds for approval of a new one.
And they're not exceeding the square footage,
Right, but if we have somebody else in a B5 that comes through and we look at our conditions that we read here and they say to somebody else, essentially, one of the conditions essentially says if somebody else provided this opportunity, isn't that justification for the next person to do that?
No, and especially, I think, because of the special conditions here, that you have 13 individual condominiumized parcels or owners on one piece. That makes it a very specific special condition. And so if someone came back with the literal exact situation, I think we'd be having a similar conversation. But the grounds aren't, there's no precedent set based on one interpretation, one ruling or another. That's why I said it was important to clarify that although we referenced several other parcels or developments in town, those are all individually dealt with prior to this board even being formed, right, in its current construct. So, no, one ruling doesn't constitute approval of another.
These are not lighted signs, correct?
Well, this is a business district, so illumination, direct and internal, is permitted.
It's permitted.
Yep. So whether they're shown as being lit or not, it's permitted to light them.
They still are subject to all of the requirements
Light, yep.
for illumination with
Yeah.
other signs, so. I think there's gonna be multiple clarifications here, and I'd like to kind of just, we've got our motion, we've got our second, we've already had one proposed amendment that was accepted by both the maker of the motion and the second of the motion, so, I think it should go without saying, but I think it's worth pointing out that strict adherence to all the illumination requirements and other sign criteria would be applicable to this variance request. other than the fact that we're allowing the variance for height to far exceed this because we're negating 13 individual signs, right? It is a large request. It's a abnormally large variance to nearly double what would normally be allowed, but it's also a very unique, this again referencing back to the special conditions, so.
But do we have to keep, we got ordinances in place that say they can put this much light, it has to be down.
Yep.
Direct, we don't have to address that. It's not,
Just strict adherence to the sign.
I don't
Yeah,
think we
we
need to
need
address
strict
anything
then.
that requires enforcement. I mean, enforcement is enforcement, so I don't know why we'd
It's a whole
have to.
separate,
have to
it's a
even
whole
bring it
separate
up.
conversation
it's-
then. So we have a motion, I'll call the question the motion, right? So we've got a motion on the table. Jim amended that motion, and Liz accepted the amendment. So we have a motion, we have a second, to allow the signage as presented in the applicant's application. I had proposed a condition of the westernmost sign. The applicant conceded that that would be used for the 13 individual tenants. Is there any opinion about that particular discussion topic?
So the motion is to offer the variance in height and square footage for this sign, but to exclude this sign? Or to
That was
offer
the-
for both?
That was the question I was posing.
Okay.
There has been no discussion on that particular item. That was my,
It's a future sign?
well, it says future boulevard entrance with sign, location to be determined. So I was trying to attempt to exclude it from this motion because it's for a future boulevard and for a future sign. Whether or not you guys agree
I
with
would
that
say
is.
that, but that's probably something that should go in the plan of the future
Well,
plan.
I think what he was saying is we could add, he would prefer we add the provision that it be for these unique 13 businesses that are already there and on the lot that exist. Because
Correct.
if we take it out, then they have this additional square footage.
I don't think we can exclude it. I mean, we've already interpreted language that says they get a right to this signage. I don't see how we can exclude.
No, but the condition would be that it's used.
That it's
as
used
they
for these 13.
Indicated they would use it for the 13 individual.
Oh, that it's used for these
And
13
it's
as
on
opposed to
the
being used for
existing-
future development.
Correct.
And that it's on the existing
And it's on the
piece of
existing
land.
parcel.
I think it
But
should be
if they were to
existing buildings, not existing owners.
Correct.
Help me understand, if they were to expand the development, they would obviously have more access to more signage. So why would we have to require that they use it for, if they don't, if we require they use it for this particular portion of the development?
This is the gray area because they've got these specific condominiums, so moving forward, those condominiums would have to be bought and sold, which makes them different than a leased premises, right?
Yeah.
Where if they were leasing 1,200 square feet today, it could be 2,000 square feet tomorrow. So that signage that would be allowed there for that particular tenant would be different, right? That tenant would be getting signage based on their frontage on the
Yeah.
wall, right? So now we've taken all that out of the mix because these are individually owned. That's the interpretation we made. They're individually owned, so they're going to individually be sold. So we're negating the 13 individual signs by allowing these. I'm more apt to allow that future sign, or allow that sign at a future boulevard entrance. The boulevard entrance is out of our purview, that's planning commission. So if that sign, if the applicant's willing to put that sign into, or on this parcel and adhere with the rest of this variance, I think that would be an applicable condition. It wouldn't be to exclude it anymore, it would be that it is to be used for the 13 divisions as they're currently assigned. Make sense?
Yes.
Kind of.
So we have a motion, we have a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed?
Aye.
Motion carries. Peter, you want to read the language for the resolution now? That'll be different for the
Well,
approval than-
the language we have is for if we do the minutes in our ordinance, so.
Okay. So you don't have new language?
Nope.
Okay. So basically what's going to happen is we will sign the resolution indicating that the approval has been granted, and you will not be subject to having us approve that at the next meeting. So your 21-day approval period would start
When the resolution is signed.
once the resolution is signed.
Should not be the next few days or this week.
Correct.
Thank you for your time.
Back to the agenda. We've already covered items 1 through 9. At this point, item 10, we'd open extended public comment at 8:05. It's restricted to 5 minutes regarding any issue. Seeing no interest, we will close extended public comment at 8:06. Final board comment.
I have comment.
Sure.
I would only say that to explain why I voted against the variance is because I feel as though we made the decision. And I do have concern, and I can bring this back to the planning commission, and we can talk about in terms of ordinance. We're working on our ordinance right now, what we might do to mitigate this in the future. But I have concerns about what we've just opened up in terms of allowing any condominiumized project to put a separate sign for each individually owned portion of that. But my goal is to interpret the ordinance as closely to what the ordinance says as possible. So I voted against the variance today because I don't think a variance was required. It didn't seem to me it didn't pass muster. Now, do I want 13 signs? No, I don't want 13 signs, but I feel as though it's my obligation to vote based on the ordinance, and I don't think what we went through today suggests anything other than we really didn't want 13 signs. I don't think it passed muster for a variance.
But if one of our customers.
Hold on, Jim.
That was my only comment.
Okay.
I was just trying to
Okay.
explain
I didn't
why I
wanna cut
was
Ryan off.
not supportive of the
But I
variance.
think
Thank you.
if our customers are told that's what they have to do, I mean, that's not, us as a board, it's not our problem. That's what we get from staff. I mean, it's what comes to us. We can only do,
We
I
only
mean,
make
I totally
interpretations.
agree that it probably wasn't needed because it was a condominium, but there was some confusion on whether it was a condominium or what a condominium is, I guess, in my opinion. So they couldn't get a building permit, they couldn't do what they wanted to do until they went through this process, whether they needed to go through this process or not.
Like I said, we could sit and debate for a while, I'm sure, but I just wanted the board to understand where I'm coming from as a planning commissioner, and I am new to the board, and it's going to take me some time to learn how the appeals process works as well, so.
Appreciate it. Any additional comment? Seeing no additional comment from the board, I'll close the meeting.
Did we have an
adjourned at-
extended public comment?
I did.
Okay.
I did.
Just wanna
8:05,
make sure.
8:06.
Just wanna
Open
make
and
sure.
close. Meeting adjourned, 8:08.